knowing that we have a system where we have skilled individuals who can help us understand what the most vulnerable members of society want to say has enabled us to listen to them and has enabled us to ensure that they have a voice, to ensure that no one is disenfranchised from our legal system.
Did you paint it?
Can you tell me your name?
Matthew.
Matthew. And how old are you, Matthew?
12.
Everyone has the right to be heard when they find themselves involved with the justice system. But that can be a real challenge for people who have difficulty communicating.
My job is just to help work out how it's best to ask those questions so you can give the best bit of information that you can.
My son, he has a diagnosis of Asperger's autism, which means that he cannot process the language like you and I would.
Well, my brother has special needs. He's got learning difficulties and he's also disabled. He doesn't really take everything in.
Information needs to be broken down into smaller pieces for her to understand.
People's ability to communicate may be affected by different factors. They may be children. They may be adults with learning disabilities, neurological problems such as a stroke, physical disabilities like cerebral palsy, or mental health conditions. They may be too traumatized to communicate, or they may be vulnerable older people. As a result, people can have difficulty expressing what they want to say, and their ability to give evidence as a witness may be compromised. Defendants may find it hard to understand the case against them, and it may be difficult for judges, advocates, and police officers to understand them. We are going through a sea change in the way children and vulnerable adults are questioned. Much of this is attributable to Intermediaries, a small group of independent communication specialists. They've become a valued new profession since being introduced in 2004 as a special measure under the Youth Justice and Criminal Evidence Act of 1999.
There may be some body parts coming around because it's some sort.
Intermediaries come from a variety of professions such as speech and language therapy, psychology and psychiatric care, teaching and social work. They undertake further training to become intermediaries.
I work with adolescents, and that's through up into adults, including older adults, and it's people who have a history of mental health issues or learning disability or learning difficulties, and often a mixture of all of these. So recently I worked with a young person with autistic spectrum disorder and learning difficulties and a traumatised young person. Assessing his communication needs, developing a working relationship with her in conjunction with other supports that people around her, the police officer and the social worker. Without that, I don't think she would have got to court at all.
I tend to work with children and vulnerable adults if they've got like an autistic spectrum disorder or learning difficulties or language disorder. I worked with a young man. He had a language disorder and a speech sounds disorder, and I know that he would not have been able to give his evidence because nobody could fully understand what he was saying. But because I could see the pattern of his speech sounds, when he was asked a question, I was able to say word for word what the vulnerable witness was saying. And I always obviously checked with him that I'd got it correct. And that made it possible for the jury to hear and understand his information.
I work with children who've got age-related communication, which basically means that they are vulnerable because of their age.
Water. Oh my goodness.
But it would be usual for a child, particularly a primary school child or a preschool child, to have an intermediary because they would be vulnerable in terms of not being able to say to people in authority that they are having a difficulty with understanding or expressing themselves. I had a case of a 3-year-old, and this 3-year-old was obviously quite anxious and did not want to be separated from her mother. I sought agreement for the defence barrister to come out to the live link room and complete their cross-examination face-to-face, and that facilitated communication on both sides. The barrister was able to engage better with the child, and that enabled the child to give more complete and more coherent evidence.
Mostly I work with deaf people who use sign language or have limited sign language. I work with deaf people with learning disabilities. I have to adapt to their signing skills, adapt to their communication, perhaps use some visual resources. One case that I worked on was a child who was a victim. He was profoundly deaf, had no sign language skills, but he'd been sexually abused by a family member. So communication with him was very, very difficult. So I had to work with him for a long time, building rapport, getting to understand his communication.
The role of the intermediaries is set out in law. Intermediaries facilitate communication with witnesses and defendants who have communication needs. Their primary function is to improve the quality of evidence and aid understanding between the court, the advocates and the witness or defendant.
Intermediaries are impartial. They do not represent or support a vulnerable witness or defendant. They are there solely to facilitate communication.
The importance of the intermediary's independence, again, is set out in law, so I'm going to read that again. Intermediaries are independent of parties and owe their duty to the court.
He's got good communication when he's actually speaking himself. His vocabulary is good. He can give you a really good narrative.
I try not to think about the details of the case. I'm there to assist both prosecution and defence. I'm there to assist the judge.
If we can explain to him what the offence is accusing him of doing and see whether he admits to that behaviour.
That I'm part of a team rather than being a team of people within the courtroom rather than being part of either defence or prosecution.
And sometimes it helps to just draw something rather than really explain.
Intermediaries can assist at all stages of a case, at police interviews and video identifications, in pre-trial planning and at trial. Their role begins with information gathering and a communication assessment.
So I might look at things like, can they give me a narrative account of something not associated with the offence, but what's their narrative account like? What kind of questions do they understand? What depth of information can they give me once I've asked them a question? What their attention skills are like, which gives me an indication as to how long the interview process can go on for. What kind of resources will help focus their attention if their attention is not very good. So for example, with a child, I may do very much play-based assessments. Which is the hardest riff to play? With an adult, I might be doing that more conversationally. Sometimes it looks so natural, the conversation, that people don't actually think I'm assessing.
He met with her on several times, sometimes just for a cup of tea and a chat. He was understanding how to ask questions, how to direct them, how to put her at ease and make her feel comfortable.
With the vulnerable person's consent, intermediaries may also gather information from people who know the person or who work with them, as well as from medical and social reports. Intermediaries use a variety of aids to help vulnerable people communicate about subjects they find difficult, to manage their anxiety and stress, and to communicate non-verbally.
So I've got a range of fidget objects here. Kids who maybe have an ADHD diagnosis, instead of having some sort of fidget object, helps the brain work across that and just helps them be settled and sit with the anxiety. I've also got my take a break card. Sometimes people, it can just reassure people to say, look, if you're struggling, you don't even need to speak, you can just point. A common one, very common for intermediaries, is body maps. Often if it's a sexual offence, it can be very difficult to talk about the specific parts of the body, and this allows people to point. Quite simple, but actually very, very effective and used often.
One of the aids that I use is not very technological, simply a button that is made for the witness, and they can point to this in the police interview and then later a cross-examination at court to demonstrate that they're having trouble with one of the questions that's being put to them.
What happened next?
It can feel more discreet and less exposing to point to a button.
Intermediaries help police officers to plan their interviews with vulnerable witnesses by suggesting how questions and answers will be most easily understood. And they also facilitate communication during interviews.
So what I want to do, I just want to make sure I've understood you and I've got it right in my head.
This process is easier when interviewing officers are present when the intermediary conducts the communication assessment. Intermediaries may also assist communication when suspects are interviewed and during pre-trial conferences with lawyers and vulnerable defendants.
What we're going to do now is we're just going to focus on the handbag.
Yeah.
So tell me as much as you can about the handbag.
I've had a couple of cases where the victims have been non-verbal, haven't been able to communicate verbally at all, and I don't think we'd have got any account from them without an intermediary.
In terms of
Well-
being too leading?
Oh, no.
One that really sticks in my mind was a very vulnerable young man. He made a disclosure to his sister one day on a day out, which led them to come to police and report that he'd been the victim of an offence. When I met this gentleman, it was very, very clear that his communication style would not, he was not understanding everything that I was saying. I applied for an intermediary, and having that intermediary on board was hugely helpful to me because I could change my questioning, if you like, so that I knew he would totally understand what I was asking of him, and I would obtain obviously his best evidence, and where I did maybe ask a question that wasn't the best or framed the best way, then the intermediary was there to say to me, well, maybe we ought to try asking this way.
If a case goes to trial, the intermediary will conduct a further communication assessment and provide a report to the court with advice and recommendations about questioning and other adjustments that are likely to enable effective participation. Judges discuss the recommendations and rule on them at ground rules hearings. These are required in all cases that involve an intermediary.
The ground rules hearing is the opportunity for the intermediary to address the court about the special measures that need to be put in place to enable the best evidence to be elicited from the witness.
So an effective ground rules hearing is one where questions are supplied in advance of that hearing to all parties, including the intermediary. And that allows the intermediary time to consider those questions and also to potentially offer some alternatives if the topic is appropriate, but the format of that questioning isn't. It's often through working quite collaboratively that we find a way of finding the words and the phrases and the tone to ensure that a complex issue is dealt with by a witness in a way that is perhaps challenging, but also fundamentally fair, a real and robust test, but that hasn't taken advantage of any of the vulnerabilities of that witness.
It is helpful for the intermediary to attend a pre-trial court visit with the witness and to advise the witness service on the vulnerable person's particular requirements.
At the visit, they will see the live link room where they may be giving their evidence. They'll get a tour of the courtroom, and they'll also meet with the witness service, who will be giving them that very valuable support on the day that they attend court.
Going to a new place is very difficult. He took her to the courthouse to meet all of the staff and to see the room she was going to be interviewed in, so that she was aware of those surroundings.
Court visits help the intermediary to assess which option for giving evidence best suits the witness.
Because intermediaries have that connection with a defendant or a witness and understand their particular communication needs or vulnerabilities, they'll often be able to open my eyes to, well, hang on a moment, might this witness want to give evidence from a remote location? Might this defendant want to use the live link in court? So it's a very practical way of helping the particular witness give their best evidence.
With the judge's permission, the intermediary will accompany the vulnerable person during the trial and flag up potential miscommunication, or if the person becomes tired or distressed.
When it became difficult for my son in the court, we would take time out. She had got to know him so well that actually she understood when he needed a break, and it might have been 10 minutes after the last break, but that was when the break needed to come.
Was very good at stepping in and saying, can you rephrase the question, she doesn't understand, or can you ask a different question?
She was talking to him all the while to make sure that he understood exactly what was being said by the legal team. So otherwise he would have just sat there, he wouldn't have known what was going on.
Intermediaries for vulnerable witnesses are available through the Witness Intermediary Scheme, run by the National Crime Agency for the Ministry of Justice. This scheme does not cover vulnerable defendants or parties in family proceedings, but judges may on occasion use their discretion to appoint an intermediary from outside the scheme in these circumstances.
I would very much like to see that we had an absolute parity across the system for all vulnerable witnesses in court, and for that to include defendants.
My experience of working with intermediaries has certainly changed the way that I work. They have helped judges understand that there is no one-size-fits-all for all witnesses and defendants. And I think we're now far more alert to what an individual, in fact, needs and requires to give their best evidence.
I think now it would be in consideration in every single case I have, whereas before I might have just thought I can go and do the interview, see how I get on. Now I wouldn't even consider doing that without having first considered an intermediary, and I would prefer to have an intermediary every time if I could get one.
Intermediaries on the ground with individual cases can properly guide and lead advocates to ensure that the witness can fully participate in the trial.
If we didn't have an intermediary, what do you think?
Just no.
No, she wouldn't have wanted to go through the interview process. She wouldn't even contemplate going into the court.
When you've got somebody like that who's really vulnerable, who doesn't really understand what's going on, I think it's vital that they have an intermediary.
It gave my son the strength to find his own voice and be understood and be heard.